we're going to talk today about is church fathers, and specifically what church history has dubbed the apostolic fathers, to make a distinction. There are about roughly 60, 65 individuals who are called fathers of the church because of their renowned intellect and their great spirituality and their holiness and of their insights into the faith and their writings and things like that. They really bolstered the faith. They sort of gave the faith its vocabulary, coming up with words like Trinity and that sort of thing. So everything that we have inherited in the faith has been passed on through these particular 60, 65 individuals, and then all of the thousands and millions of people upon whom we stand on their shoulders. Now, there are one select group within this select group, and they're referred to as the apostolic fathers because these individuals knew the apostles and learned the faith directly from the apostles themselves. And they're called apostolic, obviously, because they are associated with the apostles in a personal way. I know everybody in the back probably can't quite see this, but I'll go over it. It's just a little timeline I set up for you, and we'll talk about these guys. But Peter and Paul and John are the main sources, were the main education sources for these four individuals. The four individuals are Clement of Rome, who was the fourth bishop of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna. If any of you know anyone who's about to have a child, Polycarp is a cool name for a child. And Papias of Hierapolis. Papias of Hierapolis is another cool name. These four individuals learned the faith sitting at the feet of the apostles. They were taught by them, and because of that, they have a very high place as far as the sort of the tone they set for the faith. And I want to talk about each of these guys from two respects. One, what did they actually do with their lives? What were they teaching? What were they believing? What had they learned? And how did their lives come to an end? And in many cases, in most of the cases here, it wasn't a pleasant end. And you would ask yourself, well, what exactly were these guys willing to die for? Well, if you want to know the answer to that question, then you just spend your time looking at what did they do with, what were they preaching with their lives? What did they believe? What were they telling their congregations and the people that came to them? What did they die for? They died for their beliefs. Ultimately, they died for a person. Nobody really dies for an idea. People die for a person. They die for an ideal, for something that is deeply held belief, and for these individuals, that deeply held belief was Jesus Christ and his teachings that they had learned from the apostles. So I'd like to start with our first fellow, Polycarp, our namesake. For anybody who's seriously, if anybody has, you got a brother or somebody who's about to have a child, it's a great name. It's a cool name. Polycarp studied under John, the Apostle John. He was bishop of a town called Smyrna, and he was appointed bishop of Smyrna by John, the Apostle, under the reign of Marcus Aurelius. If you'll remember Marcus Aurelius from The Gladiator, I'm going to take a wild guess that if I ask for a show of hands for how many people in here have seen Gladiator, I'm going to see an anonymous show of hands. Is that the case? How many people have seen Gladiator? How many people have seen Gladiator more than 14 times? Marcus Aurelius, played wonderfully by Richard Harris, was not quite the philosopher king that you would like that he was portrayed in the movies. He was a bloodthirsty, slaughtering emperor, and when something threatened his throne or threatened his empire, he cracked down on it and killed them without even a thought of it. Polycarp perished under the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Now, Polycarp has a very interesting story has grown up around the martyrdom of Polycarp. He was, he was 86 years old when he was sentenced to be burned at the stake. On his way to the stake, a loud voice was heard by people, and the voice said, "Be strong, Polycarp, play the man." And my dad's 78, and I can't imagine my dad 10 years younger, sort of feebly hobbling along to go to being burned at the stake. Polycarp had an inspiration, a shot in the arm, so to speak. So valiant was he in his beliefs that Jesus would take care of him, that the typical rule back in the day was that they would nail you to the stake so that you wouldn't squirm and run away or try to get out of the fire once they started the fire. So they would nail you to the stake, put your hands behind you and jam spikes through your hands and talk about, these Romans, these guys were, if you wanted an execution squad, the mafia had nothing on the Romans. So he asked, instead of being nailed, if he could be tied to the stake instead, because he said his Lord would give him the strength to withstand the flames and not squirm about and all of that. So for some reason, the Roman authorities obliged his request and merely tied him to the stake. Then they said, light the fire, and they lit the fire, and the flames started swirling up around him, and they didn't touch him. The accounts of this martyrdom, and there are a number of them, all seem to agree on the point that the fire swirled around him but didn't come in towards him. It was, one of the writers described it as though there was some sort of wind or breath keeping the fire away from him. So the Roman authority present at the time ordered the head executioner to plunge a sword or a spear through the flames into Polycarp and kill him that way. And that is how Polycarp died. Polycarp has a very interesting story about what he believed and what it was he died for. Now, we're talking roughly here around the year 150, 160. So the church is about 100 years old, but Polycarp is 86 years old. And as he's going to get killed, the Roman authorities gave him one more opportunity to renounce Christ, one more chance. And what they used to do when you were asked to renounce Christ, there were three things that had to happen. One, you had to make a verbal rejection of Christ. Then you had to make a verbal homage to whoever the god was, or the emperor, or whoever it was, usually the Roman emperor, some statue of him. And you had to offer a little pinch of incense, just a little thing, not a big deal, right? Just a little pinch of incense. Well, Polycarp wouldn't do that. Now, there's an interesting thing here that you would take an oath. You would oath out of your oath to Christ, and you would oath in to your oath to the emperor. And the Latin and Greek for those words is where we get ex or schism from. That you would take an oath against Christ and for something else. In the moment he was asked that, he said, "For 86 years I have served my king. How could I now reject my king after he saved me?" It's interesting that he says, while that's a very noble thing to say and that's a good thing to concentrate on, what's interesting is that he's 86 years old and he says, "For 86 years I have served my king." This is one of the first indications we have that baptism was actually done to infants, because he references that his entire life he was a Christian. So it's true, if you read through the scriptures, you will not find any line or reference that says, "and they baptized the baby." But here's something that, if he was 86 when he died, and if you back up the 86 years, you're talking about in the first 50 years of Christianity, about the year 80 or so, here's a small infant being baptized. It's extra biblical support for the notion of infant baptism. "For 86 years I have served my king, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme the king who has saved me?" That was his response. You know, you read things like this when I'm preparing for these sorts of things and looking through them and doing the research and pulling my notes together, and you can't help but think, what if that was me? Would I have done that? Now, maybe if I would have had a voice come from heaven and say, be strong, play the man. But, you know, the guy gets rewarded for a lifetime of faithful service. Remember that during the early part of the church, you've got these persecutions already starting. First of all, there's the persecution from the Jews in Jerusalem, and which sort of sends the church scattering a little bit out into the other parts of the empire, and then Paul, of course, takes the word to most of the Gentiles. But as you move through the history of the Roman emperors, there is just sort of one persecution after another. Now, there are breaks in the persecutions, yes. There are pockets where the persecution isn't quite as violent as it is in other parts. Sometimes it was more violent in the east. Sometimes it was more violent in North Africa. Sometimes it was more violent in different parts of Europe. But the point was, if you were a Christian back then, it was open season on you. If the consul of the area or the governor of the region chose not to be particularly excited about fulfilling the emperor's decree, well, then, you were probably okay. But that doesn't mean that you got off scot-free. We talk about martyrdom all the time in the faith, and we always think about the lions ripping Christians to pieces in the amphitheaters of Rome. That's certainly true. But there were other types of martyrdom. How would you feel, because this is how they lived for centuries, all the early Christians, how would you feel if you always knew in the back of your mind that anytime somebody wanted to, the local police chief could just come in and take the furniture out of your house and take a couple of your kids? Now, is that a martyrdom? Well, not in the sense we think of a blood martyrdom, no. But is it a martyrdom nonetheless? Absolutely, it's a martyrdom. But this is what it is. This is how these people lived for essentially 300 years in the church. Many times you were just hauled off to slavery. You had to serve, you just were in the mines for the rest of your life. Were those folks martyred? Sure, that's a martyrdom. So my point here is to say that, yes, there is what we call in the church the red martyrdom, or the martyrdom of blood, where you actually give up your life, and many, 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 many Christians had to do that. But there's also the living out of the martyrdom, a white martyrdom where you're just sort of continually martyred and persecuted throughout. That's the case here in the 21st century if you're a Christian. Is it as bad as it was then? No. Can it get that way? Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Take a look at some of the stories. There's a couple of priests up in Canada right now, Catholic priests up in Canada, who are up on charges for saying that homosexuality is a bad thing. They're being tried, go to court, arrested, have to come up with a defense because they violated the law. There are a number of situations in Europe where things are going the same way. I would not be surprised if you looked at a trajectory of things, and of course grace and people's hearts and minds can always change, but if you were to look at a trajectory of the way things are going right now, things do not look good for Christians as viewed from the outside world. Are we going to have to stand up for our faith? Oh, sure. Catholic hospitals in California are in the middle of embroiled in a lawsuit saying that they have to provide abortions and birth control services. When I was in seminary back in New York 20 years ago, there was a little battle between Mayor Ed Koch, flamboyant, New York mayor, and Cardinal O'Connor. And Cardinal O'Connor was a wonderful, wonderful man. He was the Cardinal Archbishop of New York when I was in seminary. I had the opportunity to sit and talk with him for about 3 hours about television efforts in the Archdiocese. Wonderful, holy man. Mayor Ed Koch and the New York City Borough Council presidents, whatever the city council is, said that they were going to pass a resolution, pass a city ordinance, that crucifixes could no longer be on the walls or doors or on public display in Catholic hospitals, because Catholic hospitals accepted federal funds, Medicare funds that are administered by the state, and they weren't allowed to have those up anymore. Well, Cardinal O'Connor said, well, that's fine. Then we'll shut down every Catholic hospital there is in the Archdiocese of New York. There was no deliberation. There was no committee meetings about the thing. There was no like, oh, let's hire a blue ribbon panel and study the issue. When that got presented to him, he said, then we'll close down every Catholic hospital. Those crucifixes are not coming down. And Ed Koch was like, oh, well, that's not a very reasonable, blah, blah, blah. Well, somebody came up to Ed Koch, one of his guys, who did do a little study and a little committee, and figured out that one-third of the total hospital beds in New York was a Catholic bed. And they said, Mr. Mayor, if you want to do that, go ahead, but you got to find a place to put this, you're going to increase your state load by 50%. Are you ready to do that? And he's like, crucifixes don't look so bad. They're all right. But, we have to fight evil. We have to fight evil. We have to fight evil, first of all, by our personal holiness. And that's what these guys did, and all of their followers, or most of their followers. We have to be holy in every respect. That's what we're called to be. It's the first and last thing we are called to be. In the meantime, we're supposed to help other people become holy as well. That's the only thing we're on this earth for. That's it. For those of you, most of you, I'm presuming, have families, married and have families. They're your first responsibility, yourself and them. Get them to heaven. Instruct them. Bring them the faith so that they can go out and bring other people to heaven. John Paul said the family is the sort of the first church. It's where we learn about the faith for the most part. That's our responsibility, is to be holy, live holy, show our children, show our friends and families that we are trying to live holy, and then go be holy. 12 men changed the world. Another fellow we're going to talk about here, Papias of Hierapolis. Papias was an associate, friend, companion of Polycarp. They knew each other. It's not exactly clear from the research whether Papias actually knew John or not. Some readings, he's called a hearer of John in a lot of the writings, but we're not exactly sure what that means. It could be just sort of metaphysically or metaphorically a hearer of John, like we are all hearers of Jesus. It also might be that he is a hearer, as in he sat there listening to him. We're not sure, but we do know that Papias was definitely associated with Polycarp, and they wrote letters back and forth. Most of the church histories that were written in the next generation reference the fact that they were good friends and they hung out together and they knew each other and all of that sort of thing. Papias is interesting. We don't really have many surviving writings from Papias. As a matter of fact, we don't have any surviving writings from Papias. What we have of his writings are copies in other people's things. So like if the Declaration of Independence, the original, was to disappear off the face of the earth for some reason, we would still know what it said because we have copies of it and it's been transcribed in history books and whatever. This is how much of this ancient research is done. We don't necessarily have the original documents, but we have the documents to indicate, oh, this is what they were because they're quoting sections from it. Papias, interestingly enough, is where we get our understanding of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. That John Mark, was actually the son of Mary, the wife of Clopas. And the upper room that's referenced in the scriptures for the Last Supper, and where Jesus used to meet with his apostles, and where they were when Jesus rose from the dead and all that, that upper room was in the upstairs in the house of Clopas and his wife Mary, and Mark, who wrote the gospel, was their son. We know a little bit about Mark from Scripture also because Mark was, can't exactly gather, but he was a young teenager, 15, 16, 17, somewhere around that age, and went on a mission with St. Paul. And you get, as you read the Scriptures, you don't get the feeling that Paul was the most patient of guys, and having this sort of young kid around annoyed the living, whatever out of him. And the next time they're getting ready to go on a trip, he's like, no, you're not going. And he got in a big fight with Barnabas over this. And he said, no, you stay. So what eventually happens is that when Peter leaves Jerusalem, whenever this happens, Mark goes along with him. And where does he go? He goes to Rome. And so Mark is credited with being the fellow who wrote down Peter's narration of what happened in the life of Jesus. Peter didn't write the Gospel of Mark, but it's Peter's Gospel as written by Mark. We get this information from Papias. Papias also had a very interesting quote. Let me see if I can find it for you here very quickly. He said that he preferred to find the living voice, not look in books. Papias is living around the year 90, 100, 120, in that time frame. And it's curious that here's a fellow who, even then, is talking about the living tradition of the church as vis-a-vis written word, the written word. Now, the Gospels are all being written by this time, or very close to it, around this time. St. John wrote the last Gospel. Wrote the book of Revelation around, 90, somewhere in the 90s. So there is a tradition. Paul's already written most of his letters because he's dead in the year 64, 67, right around there during the Nero persecution in Rome. So there are already Christian documents floating around. Some of them are inspired, some of them are just good, others are fake, saying things about Christ and the church that aren't true. And here's a fellow, Papias, who's saying, it's the living word. It's the tradition. It's the whole, you might want to say, it's not sola scriptura. Here's a guy saying this back in the first generation of Christians, that we don't look at just writings. We look at those writings in interpretation of how we live this out. That's a very key point. That's back in the very first generation, we call it the second generation of Christians. Ignatius of Antioch, this guy's tremendous. Ignatius is tremendous. Ignatius is the bishop of Antioch. Now, Antioch, if you look in the Acts of the Apostles, you'll find different terms. You'll find different terms for the groups of Christians. Now, they're originally called the followers of the way. The word Christian doesn't pop up until sometime after the church is beginning to become established and sort of organized. Initially, they're just called the followers of the way. The term Christian appears in Antioch. The bishop there becomes Ignatius. Ignatius takes a look at the church and says that the dimension of the church as he sees it is certainly Christian, but it's Catholic. He's the first one to use the term Catholic in writing as far as we know. But he is probably not the first one to have made the observation that the church is Catholic. Now, the word Catholic has sort of a double sense to it. It does mean universal, sort of its primary sense, but it also means universal beyond just, hey, it's in Smyrna and Hierapolis and Rome and Athens and Corinth. It also means it in the sense that it's universal in its belief, that we all believe this same thing, that it's the whole universal belief of the church. And we know this because Ignatius was taken to Rome, and along the way there was this very long journey along the major routes of Rome. And every time he was taken to a city, and the battalion or whoever it was that was with him rested, the local Christians would come out and stay with him, bring him food, tend to him. They heard he was coming, et cetera, et cetera. So he would write letters along the way, and he wrote 7 letters to 7 different communities, and he wrote one to the church in Smyrna, which, of course, is where Polycarp was. And he wrote a letter, and in that letter is where he mentioned the word Catholic. It's the first time with the surviving documents. You might find something, some archaeological dig might dig up something else and make this the second or third mention. But for right now, it's the first time we have in writing that the church is Catholic, and that sort of fuller sense of what that means. He also, in that letter, said, wherever the bishop appears, let there be the people, as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not lawful to baptize or give communion without the consent of the bishop. On the other hand, whatever has his approval is pleasing to God. Thus, whatever is done will be safe and valid. Not only do you have Catholic written right there by his own hand, you also have the beginning of, in writing, the beginning of an understanding of a bishop. He's in charge. There's one, not many, in the local church. You can start to see from some of these writings already the formation or the reflection of the formation of what's already happening in the church. That the church is Catholic, that there is infant baptism in it, that the bishop is in charge in each local area, etc., etc. You see the development of this going on, and it's reflected in these writings. Ignatius was a extremely holy man. He actually longed for martyrdom. I have a priest, a spiritual director of mine, is a very holy man, and he said to me one day during spiritual direction, he said, it suddenly occurred to me that to not long for martyrdom could be a spiritual flaw. And I'm like, what do you mean, Father? But, his point's well taken. Many of these martyrs, many of these guys, not the apostolic fathers, but many Christians of the day used to goad the Roman groups into the Roman soldiers and the Roman citizenry into trying to martyr them. They would yell things to the crowds like, "I want to meet my Lord. I want to meet my Lord. I'm ready to be martyred." And one of the classic comebacks, some Roman citizens were walking by, and I don't know who it was. I'm not sure it's mentioned who the individual was who yelled that to them. But their response was, "Well, there's plenty of cliffs. Go jump off one." They didn't sort of get the idea of martyrdom. But the early Christians wanted to undergo suffering and persecution because it united them to Christ. That's a very foreign concept in today's Western world, where you get a headache and you have to immediately rush out and get aspirin. These guys immediately wanted to suffer. They saw suffering, they saw pain, they saw this as a way to be with Christ in every possible way they could. Ignatius, in one of his letters, wrote on his way to Rome to be killed in the Colosseum, wrote that he was looking forward to being crushed in the jaws of the beast like fine wheat crushed into a pure flour for his Savior. Wow, there's something deep. On his way to martyrdom, he wrote this: "Take note of those who hold heterodox opinions on the grace of Jesus Christ which has come to us, and see how contrary their opinions are to the mind of God. They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer because they do not confess the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, flesh which suffered for our sins and which that the Father in his goodness raised up again." That is a pretty powerful defense of the teaching of the Eucharist. Did the church have words at this point? Had the word transubstantiation made its way into the vocabulary? No, that wouldn't be for centuries later. But the idea is there. The belief is there. This guy wanted to go be ground up in the jaws of a lion or wild dogs or whatever it was that particular day because he loved Christ in the Eucharist. Again, we have to ask the questions internally, and this is, there's a lot of history and stuff here, but the main point is of hearing all of this is to reflect back and say, is this how we live our faith, all of us? Is this how we see the Eucharist? We go to the do we go to the Adoration Chapel? Do we go spend time with Jesus? On the way home, back and forth to work, do we take 10 minutes, just 10 minutes during the course of a week to stop in and kneel in front of our King and our Savior? Do we do that? We're too busy? If we're too busy to do that, then we are too busy. If we're too busy for Christ, then you're right. Boy, we are too busy. These guys wanted to be devoured by wild animals because of their belief in this. I often say on the TV show that we have to get back to the way the faith was lived and loved and believed in the beginning of the church, because they were so persecuted, and I don't want to say they wanted the persecution in that sense, like they were sadomasochists, but they understood that in this persecution they were united to Christ, that this was a cross for them, and they willingly embraced it. How many people here saw The Passion? Do you remember that scene when Jesus, just after he's condemned, and they sort of plop the cross in front of him, and he grabs a hold of the beam, the cross beam, and the bad thief, who eventually gets his eye plucked out by the raven, yells over to him, "What's wrong with you? What kind of crazy fool are you? Who embraces their cross?" And that's what the first Christians did. And there are still many Christians today who are given crosses, who live with crosses and embrace them for the sake of the kingdom. But many, it shouldn't stop at many, it should be all of us. Whatever sacrifice it takes. Here's a guy happily writing, I get to get ground up in the teeth of a lion. This is cool. I can't wait. Oh, I'm going to be... I venture to guess that no one, including me, would actually look at it that way if we were getting hauled off to some kind of camp where we were going to get gassed or shot or tortured or made to renounce Christ. The last fellow, and this fellow was associated with Peter and Paul, was Clement of Rome. He was the fourth bishop of Rome, and you'll hear his name in Mass in the first Eucharistic prayer. Peter, Linus, Cletus, Clement. This is Clement. And Clement was the bishop of Rome around the year 80, 85, and was there for, again, it's kind of hard to tell because a lot of the writings we get these things from are sort of mixed all over the place, and there's little crossover dates, and they don't necessarily name dates. They say in the 4th year of the proconsul Quirinius' reign, and they may have gotten a year wrong. So these things are always off, usually by a couple of years, but we get the idea. He's the 4th bishop of Rome. And there was a dispute in Corinth. And what's interesting to note is the date. John is still alive. The Apostle John is still alive. John, as a matter of fact, is not that far in Ephesus, is not that far from where Corinth is. But on the other side of the empire, in Rome, is Clement. Clement gets word of this dispute that's going on in Corinth. So let's do this in American geography. The Bishop of Washington, D.C., finds out that there's something going on in Denver. Now, the guy who was one of the original apostles is sitting in Colorado Springs. But Clement takes it on himself to write this very detailed letter. It's a very kind, loving letter. And he sends a delegation from him, from the community in Rome, from the church in Rome, to Corinth. You would think that John, one of the apostles, would have more authority, A, geographically, and B, because of his position of having been one of the apostles, to settle this dispute. What was the dispute? The dispute was that a group of guys or believers in Corinth kicked out the bishop and got rid of some of the priests, and we're not quite sure whether it was bishop or priest or what the terms they're using are a little unclear, but whatever, the leaders of the church, the religious leaders of the church, they kicked them out. They didn't like what they were doing or saying or whatever. Clement gets word of this, the Bishop of Rome, and in his letter to them, it's a very lengthy letter, in his letter to them, he demands that they submit to his authority. Why would a bishop in Rome, why would a bishop in Washington, D.C. insist that a church in Denver submit to his authority? Unless he thought he had that authority. He refers to the primacy of the church in Rome and underscores its importance because it's the place where the blessed apostles Peter and Paul both died. He has assumed unto himself an authority over these other churches in the face of John the Apostle, essentially a few miles away. At least Clement understands that he's got the authority because of where he is. And he sends a delegation along. And he instructs them, I'll be very happy when the delegation comes back and tells me that all of you have submitted, you've restored the religious leaders to their proper place, and the delegation comes back and tells me that everything is fine once again. And blessings and love, we do blessings, Jesus Christ, amen, Holy Spirit, goodbye. That's kind of a letter to the church, and we have those letters from popes coming today. Clement was in Rome while Domitian was the emperor. It's interesting that he writes, one of the very first lines in that letter that he writes to the church in Corinth is, I apologize for not having written to you sooner, but a series of horrible events has befallen us here, and we're sort of scrambling around trying to take care of it. That series of horrible events was the persecution that Domitian started when he was emperor against the Christians. One Christian emperor said after he had, what's the line from, will somebody please rid me of this worrisome, what's the line? Simon's English literature, what is it? Rid me of this tiresome priest. That's right. Get rid of this priest. He's an annoyance to me. One of the emperors of Rome said, I would rather have to face an army of barbarians than put up with another pope. And that was back while the persecutions were still going on. There was a fellow named Pliny the Younger, who was a lawyer, who was getting the word out to the emperor, or the proconsul and the governor of a particular region, talking about these Christians and what they were doing, and that they're cannibals, and they gather on the first day of the week for these secret meetings, and they bring babies in, and they're cannibals, and they're cannibals, because the word has gotten out that that Christians eat flesh. They eat the flesh of their God, and if you don't understand what that is, well, then that's probably a logical conclusion. He sends a letter and says, what should I do? Because people everywhere are joining these people. Everywhere we go, they're stopping worshiping the gods, and they're joining this cult. What's going on in the church here, this deep spread, is happening during the persecutions. Every one of these guys that's up here, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, and all of their followers who are nameless until we see them in heaven, hopefully, are... these people are living and dying for the faith. They're living hard lives in the faith, and many of them, in the end, are giving up their lives for it, or watching someone they love be dragged off to an amphitheater or something like that. This is how the church lived, or at least lived in fear of this, for roughly 300 years. This was life as a Christian. 300 years of this. America's what, 240 years old, whatever, 240 years old? We would still, from the entire time from the Revolution, we would still be living like this for another 60 years if you were to transpose the time on each other. Our entire history in America would be told against the backdrop of being persecuted. Well, they were going to make this wonderful movie, but they found out the director was a Christian, so they killed him. So the movie never got made. We were going to invent airplanes, but the Wright brothers were Christian, and they got killed. This is the history of the church. This is how they lived. This is how they lived. And we look back on this now and think, wow, we don't live like this. I'm not talking about there aren't official persecutions against us. We don't love the faith because we don't know the faith, and we don't equate the faith with Jesus Christ, the founder of the faith. We don't do this. It's just something we go through. We're kind of faithful when it's convenient, and when it's not, this isn't how they live the faith. Clement, when he was taken to the coast, and Domitian ordered that the ships be put on a ship, and an anchor, he be fastened to an anchor, and the anchor be thrown overboard. And that's how he was killed. If you ever see a sign, most of the saints, I don't know, you may not know this, but oftentimes when you're looking at a statue or a piece of art of a saint, particularly if they're a martyr, you'll see the sign of their martyrdom or some reminder of their martyrdom in the artwork with them. And you see St. Sebastian, for example, standing there with his hands tied behind his back with arrows all through him. You'll see, with Clement of Rome, you'll see an anchor, a ship's anchor in the painting, or if it's a statue, he's leaning on it or something like that. If you see, in the case of Ignatius, you'll almost always see a lion laying at his feet. Catholic art has done this for centuries. That's why St. Paul, if you go to the St. Peter's Square, you've got Peter on the left and Paul on the right. The statues there in the square, you'll see Paul standing there with a big sword across because he had his head chopped off, and that's the sign. And same thing, the statue out in front of St. Paul outside the walls, same thing. He's standing there with a big sword in his hand. Saint after saint after saint who's a martyr, because this is their ticket into heaven. It's something to celebrate. It's the mindset of how the church was. And it's the mindset that we, as faithful Catholics and people striving to be holy, we need to get back to that. So in just this apostolic age right here, just these four guys, what do we have as a, what do we know about the church? What are these guys dying for? Very unpleasant deaths. Can you imagine? Just close your eyes for a second and just imagine that you're on a ship. And it's probably some smelly old rickety thing, and there's slaves in it because that's how it was run. And there's some people whipping, the slaves, rowing you out there. And you know what's going to happen to you because this is the sentence that's been passed on you. And you're standing there with your hands tied behind your back, probably very uncomfortably. There's probably people jamming their spears in you just to irritate you and get, a few licks at it, the horrible Christian. And then they haul that big, huge chain up and start to fasten you onto it. And you know what's going to happen to you. And then, whoosh, over you go. And he wanted to do this. One of the things they used to do in the amphitheaters, all of the various Colosseii of Rome, the amphitheaters, was in order to make the animals tear you apart much more thoroughly, is they would kill some other animals, and with that fresh blood and skin, they would wrap you in those skins and pitch you out there like a hot dog, smelling all fresh and bloody for all these animals to come and rip you to pieces. And you'd watch this happen to your children. Can you imagine your children screaming for you? Daddy! What's your response? So horrible were these scenes that for people who had betrayed the faith, when they were asked to give worship to the gods, they turned the coward and did in fact worship the gods, renounce Christ, but then they wanted to come back to the church. These people were given enormous penances that lasted for years. They couldn't participate in the Eucharist for years. And these scenes were so violent and the suffering was so immense that the repentant apostates would yell to the Christians who were about to be devoured or set on fire or whatever it was. They would yell to them, "Offer up your suffering for me so that my penance can be reduced." And they'd get the confirmation from the people as they were lighting the torch or the animals were coming or whatever it was, and they'd say, "Yes, I do." The penitent would then take that information to the bishop and say, Bob and Sue and their family of 4 kids over here, as they were being torn apart by the lions, they offered that up for me so that my penance could be reduced so I could come back to the Eucharist. And the bishop would reduce the penance. That's what we call indulgences. Back in the first century of the church. What did these guys die for? They died for a belief in a community that was headed by the bishop. They died for the oral tradition of the faith. Many of these people had never even seen a written gospel or anything. They died believing in, I'll tell you, when Clement got chucked over the side, He believed he was the successor of Peter and had those keys and went over the side of that boat tied to that anchor because he believed that. They all believed in the Eucharist. They all believed in the real presence. Whatever they would have called it in their writings, they believed it. They believed in infant baptism. They believed that the church was Catholic. This is what they died for, because they believed that all of this was the will of Jesus Christ. That's what they were willing to undergo all of this for. And while that's a nice history lesson, and oh, that's cool, we have to ask ourselves, would we undergo the same thing? What about today when you're standing at the water cooler at work and somebody makes some comment about, hey, look how great that, did you see that chick on Desperate Housewives last night? Man, she was hot. Would you turn around and say, you know, she's a creature made to the image and likeness of God, and you shouldn't be talking about her that way, nor should she be on that way? Sex in the City. We've all heard of it. When's the last time somebody made a comment about that any of us have said to somebody we worked with or somebody at a family? Okay, you don't want to say something to your boss because you're afraid you might tick him off. All right, well, we've all had family. These conversations come up at, you know, dinners and parties and whatever. Have we ever said, that stuff is filth and is corrupting the mind of my child, and I don't like it? Oh, come on, Frank, don't be such a prude. There's a little persecution for you. Little persecution. Little bit. Do we stop and think before we go and buy something? What are we supporting when we buy this? I had a friend of mine a couple years ago, church-going, extraordinary minister of the Eucharist, who had a subscription to Playboy and was perfectly fine leaving it sitting there on the coffee table. You got to ask yourself, what is the faith? And if you believe this stuff and what these guys died for, are we out there dying for it? A little bit, but are we dying for it? If a major persecution comes for the faith, and there's precedent, there's precedent. Ask the millions of Catholics in China right now. Ask the tens of millions in Russia who had their lives extinguished by Stalin. Well, there's absolutely precedent for persecution, and don't think because we're in America it can't happen. Oh, sure it can. Are we going to stand up? Are we going to say, hey, yes, Jesus, I want this cross? If our thoughts aren't oriented like that, if this is just some big club we get together with on Sundays, and, oh, yeah, I go up and I receive Holy Communion. We've all seen people walking up to Holy Communion like they're going up getting a ticket to Cedar Point. Do we do something about that? Do we say when we're at our family gatherings, do we bring up the topics? Do we say the things that are uncomfortable? We've been to a first Holy Communion party and ever taken a moment to say to the people, our family there or our friends there, I just want to take a moment and break up all the hilarity and all the frivolity here for a moment and say, I think the most wonderful thing on earth just happened to little Jane here. Moments ago, she just received the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Would we even think of saying something like that at dinner or the party? When you're watching the Super Bowl or something, not Super Bowl, but whatever, you're watching some event with your children, and some ad comes on for, what's that, Dirty Money of Sex or whatever it is, whatever the show is. I couldn't believe the number of times I was watching a Notre Dame football game and the number of times that commercial came on, and I was thinking, thank God there aren't children sitting here right now. Do we take the moment to say to our kids or our friends, do we take the moment to say, you know what, I really object. I know we're watching a football game and this may not be the right time to say it, but you know what, when is the right time to say it? When is the right time to say it? How do we know that our friend sitting there we're watching the game with isn't given to some sort of psychological problem about sex, and when he sees the little promo shot of the 5 Desperate Housewives walking down the line, that he isn't committing lust in his heart and committing a sin right there? Do we take a moment to say what we should say? do we stand up against the tide and the current of this society? Because this society despises Christ and the church, just like these ones did. Exactly like these ones did. Are we the witnesses we need to be? You know, the word witness comes from the word martyr. It's the same word. Do we do what we're supposed to do? This is what it is to be a Christian. This is what it is to be a Christian. St. John Vianney said once, anybody who thought being a Christian was easy shouldn't have become a Christian. This is what the faith is about. It's tremendous that you guys are here with the Bravehearts group. It is tremendous that you guys are here to do this, to take whatever you hear from this, other groups, whatever, to make your faith grow and take it out there. This is what we did. As a church, this is what we did for the first 300 years, and we paid for it in our blood. We have to watch where we spend our money. We have to watch where our eyes go. We have to watch the conversations that we get into at work and in family. We have to be Christ to the world. That's the reason the church exists. And if we're not, go do something else. Why on earth would you want to be in an organization half-heartedly that demands all of this sacrifice from you and you're not really willing to? What's the point? It is hard being a good Catholic. It is hard. Because if you look back up this little line here, every one of these guys that was martyred, you move back up to the apostles, you moved on the apostles, look what happened to the top of the list. Of course, if it happened there, as he says, it'll happen all the way down. We have to do that. We have to be Jesus Christ. We have to worry about souls. Our first and last stop should be the Blessed Sacrament, Jesus in the Eucharist. Never, ever cross by a church, a Catholic church, without acknowledging your King is present in that church. Ever. Publicly. Take your hand off the wheel and cross yourself. You take the hand off the wheel to turn up the iPod. If you're sitting with somebody in the car, who cares? If it's your boss sitting there with you, say, oh, just a moment. We spend public tax dollars to build feet washing basins for other faiths. Can you take 3 seconds to acknowledge the King of Kings on the way home? This is what we're about. Christ must be in the forefront all the time. Any deviation from the purity of the faith must be checked in our own lives and the lives of those around us. This is what we're called to do. This is all we're called to do. We exist on this earth for one reason, to get to heaven, and that's it. Next, to get other souls to heaven. It's the only reason we're here. When Simon and I were driving out here this morning, I'm happy to report that we saved a soul. In the pitch black early morning hour we were driving out here, we said a chaplet of Divine Mercy and offered that chaplet up for one of the thousands of souls who at that very instant was standing in front of his Father and would have been damned for all eternity. We offered it up and said, Jesus, we offer this chaplet of mercy up so that whatever soul is in front of you right now that without the assistance from this chaplet would have been damned forever, that you shower him with mercy and save him. Save the soul. How it happened, I have no idea. Who was it? I have no idea. Hopefully, if I get to heaven, I'll meet him. And I'll say, you owe me big time, buddy. He's probably in the very last bottom room somewhere in the basement of purgatory right now. But he will be with God for all eternity because that is what was supposed to be. I have no idea why that thought came into my head, but I just went with it. That concludes all of the formal part of the talk that I want to talk about. A couple of people have asked me about this sword, so I do want to give you This is a gladius. It's what gladiators used. It weighs about 25 pounds, and I swing it around a lot. Don't worry, it won't come out. I swing it around a lot at the end of the show, saying to demonstrate the point that we are in spiritual warfare. We really are. Every great saint of the church has talked about the warfare that we're in. And it's very easy in 21st century America to be complacent and oh, well, things are fine, and oh, yeah, that's just the way people are. Yeah, that's exactly what the enemy wants people to think. We must fight. We have the powers, the weapons at our disposal that shake heaven and earth. We have the rosary. We have the chaplet of divine mercy. Most of all, we have the Eucharist and our ability to go adore our King at any moment of the day and go receive him daily if we can, at least once a week, if not. These are weapons given to us, symbolically represented by a sword. These are weapons given to us to fight. That's what we do. We are soldiers. You are Bravehearts. These guys are apostolic fathers of the church because of what they did, how they lived, and how they died, and what they lived for and what they died for. When we were building St. Michael's studio, it's in Ferndale, we were building it, I was way early before we'd even torn out a wall or done anything. We actually were still drawing up plans for the studio. I thought it would be really nice to have some sort of prop of some kind. Now, I was thinking this probably in December, I think it was. But as you're building a TV studio, as you all know, because you all build TV studios, there's a billion details. So that thought had come into my mind as like, oh yeah, we'll come up with something. I'm not quite sure what. I never thought about it again. I was coming home from a show, a movie with a friend, about the dogs in the Antarctic that were left out, 8 Below, I think it was called, or something like that. And we're talking about the movie, and hey, it was a great plot and everything. And out of nowhere, and I mean out of nowhere, this thought comes into my mind to go on eBay and find the sword of St. Michael. And it's like 1 o'clock in the morning by the time I get home. We went to a late show. So I'm like, well, that's curious. Well, okay, whatever. So I go on to eBay. I can tell you right now, if you want to waste hours of your what would be valuable sleep time, sit in front of a computer, go to eBay, type in sword, and watch what comes up. There must be 8 billion swords available. And I'm scrolling through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of swords for 2 hours going, what am I doing this for? And I said out loud, okay, this is the last page. And I clicked on it, scrolled down, and here was this sword that had 8 hours left of time on it to make the purchase. No one had made any purchase for it. So I said, okay, whatever. And I'm going to leave it over here at this table if you want to check it out, but there are 4 panels on each side of the hilt, and it is the handle. They're the 4 offices the church assigns to St. Michael. Turns out this is from the Vatican. Yeah, and from the Vatican collection. And I put in my bid. I went to bed. I got up, and for $200, I have the sword. And I was like, "Thank you, St. Michael." It arrives, I don't know, 3-4 days later, and I take it, and we were in the middle of a novena of masses for St. Michael's and everything that was going on and building everything out. And we put the sword on the altar for Mass. And the priest who said Mass, my spiritual director, blessed it for us. And in all of the travails that we have been through with St. Michael's, and we have been through quite a bit, I'm in the studio oftentimes alone at night.